Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kiorkof, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 3 running back rankings for the 2020 fantasy football season. On today's episode, of course, we're talking about my top 36 running back rankings on the week. But then before that, I want to talk about some waiver wire ads that are going to be included on top of yesterday's video. If you haven't checked that out, go check out my waiver wire video for Week 3. But I wanted to talk about some players from the Monday night game that weren't included in that video that might have some value and maybe guys that you should target this upcoming week. After that, we'll go ahead and we'll talk about some matchups going into Week 3, which running backs have the most advantageous matchup, and which defenses are giving up the most points to opposing running backs on a weekly basis in a half PPR format. Again, these rankings are typically always half PPR because I want to meet everyone in the middle. But remember, guys, as we always do, rankings are subject to change. If in fact you see a ranking here that's a little too low, remember these videos are being posted on Tuesday. And again, there are injuries, there are different players that are questionable, and sometimes I want to be precautious. Sometimes I don't have all the information until Sunday morning. So again, bear with me. These are ranking. These are my thought process as of Tuesday going into Week 3. Again, for those of you who are looking for daily up-to-date rankings, you can go ahead and check out my Patreon. The description has all the information regarding that. Or you can show up on Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. PST, in which we're talking about, starts and sits on Sunday morning, kickoff with Kiorkof. For those of you who are interested in hanging out, we almost had 1,000 people in the live chat this past weekend. Absolutely insane. I'm like running around like a madman trying to answer questions. So again, thank you for those of you who are supporting the channel, joining us on Sunday mornings. For those of you who have subscribed, again, we're going to be making fantasy football content here on the daily for the entirety of the 2020 season. So if you have not yet already, click that subscribe button, join the community. And if you like these videos, make sure you smash that like button because it really does help me out. And you guys cannot imagine how much it really makes a difference. Just one like really does make a difference in the long run. Anyway, let's go ahead and let's start talking about some waiver wire pickups from Monday night's game. An interesting game to say the very least between the Las Vegas Raiders and the New Orleans Saints. A couple of the players that I thought kind of stood out. Obviously, Darren Waller's performance was incredible. Josh Jacobs had a couple touchdowns stolen from him. The fact that Alec Ingold, the fullback, catching a touchdown on the goal line, Darren Waller's catching a touchdown on the goal line, and Jalen Richard ends up scoring a touchdown and is still playing after he fumbled and almost threw the game away. Unfortunate for Josh Jacobs, but it's a good sign that he's getting this many touches. We love to see it. But players that you should be looking for, as in waiver wire pickups far and away from this matchup. I think if in fact Michael Thomas is to miss once again, I would want to pick up Tre'Quan Smith because he is currently playing in that role of the Michael Thomas number one wide receiver. I think Emmanuel Sanders after this past week could be a drop candidate. And, to be honest, I'm so pissed off about what he did this past week. 3 targets, 1 reception for 18 yards. That is just such a disappointing performance. I'm willing to drop him in this offense because, again, outside of Alvin Kamara, and it looks to be Tre'Quan Smith, maybe a little bit of Jared Cook, there really isn't room for an Emmanuel Sanders to be performing. Yes, he caught a touchdown in week 1, but maybe I'm overreacting, but boy, did he trigger me yesterday. Regardless, as of right now, in terms of the Raiders offense, again, their biggest pieces are Darren Waller, Josh Jacobs, and then I guess Henry Ruggs, but Henry Ruggs has been banged up for the last couple of weeks. So hopefully he gets fully healthy and starts to perform down the line. But outside of that, the only other waiver wire player I wanted to mention is Devontae Freeman. I talked about him a little bit yesterday in correlation and in conjunction with the pickup of Dion Lewis. As of right now, the information that is coming out of the New York Giants organization revolves around Devontae Freeman. As long as he passes the COVID-19 test, he is going to be signed by the team later this afternoon. Now, that doesn't put him in a perfect position to be able to play this coming weekend. He might get a couple touches, but again, he needs to learn the playbook. It's going to be an adjusting process, similar to how Leonard Fournette had to adjust for the first couple weeks going into the Tampa Bay Buccaneers organization. I think Devontae Freeman, after a couple weeks, could have some value. Again, he is a great pass catching back. They are bringing him in for a reason because, again, they do not believe Devontae Freeman is Dion Lewis is going to be able to carry 3 down work. So, of course, Devontae Freeman will come in, be the 1-2 punch there, and could be a fantasy asset that you want to be picking up this week. Now that we've covered all the waiver wire information and the news regarding that, we can go ahead and move on and start talking about matchups at the running back position going into Week 3 of the 2020 fantasy football season. So as of right now, the teams that are giving up the most points to opposing running backs on a weekly basis in a half PPR scoring format are not really a surprise. The Carolina Panthers, for the second year in a row, are giving up a boatload of points to opposing running backs. They're giving up nearly 9.5, almost 10 receptions per game to opposing running backs. That is incredible. And as of right now, They have to travel to the Los Angeles Chargers this upcoming week, which they just gave Ekeler the ball, 17 times on the ground. They gave it to Joshua Kelley 23 times on the ground. The Los Angeles Chargers are going to try to run all over the Carolina Panthers. They're going to succeed in that because, goodness, they're giving up 3 touchdowns a game to opposing running backs. And that in itself, on average, seems like a recipe for success for teams playing against them. But again, the Cincinnati Bengals are one of these teams that have struggled heavily against the run. Just this past Thursday, Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt both had incredible games, both finished in like the top 6 running backs in a half PPR scoring format. Miles Sanders is going to be able to feast against them. The Las Vegas Raiders, even though they played well last night and were able to hold down the Saints and not let them really come back in that game and win, the Las Vegas Raiders did give up a lot of points to Alvin Kamara in week 2 and to Christian McCaffrey in week 1. But again, those are 2 of the best running backs in the National Football League. But these are the rest of the teams that are giving up a lot of points to opposing running backs. The Lions playing against Kenyan Drake. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who, yes, even though they're great in stopping the run, have been giving up a lot of receptions in the passing game. That is a good sign for the potential of Melvin Gordon this upcoming week. The Arizona Cardinals, they'll have to take on the Detroit Lions. Who is going to be the guy there? Is DeAndre Swift going to step up? Anyway, just wanted to give you guys some perspective as to which teams are giving up the most points in terms of teams that have been pretty stout defensively and not being, really pushed around defensively by running backs. The Baltimore Ravens, the Washington Football Team, the Los Angeles Chargers, which is a surprise, who played surprisingly well this past weekend against the defending champions, the Pittsburgh Steelers, which we're not surprised about. But again, as the weeks progress, we are going to see more and more of these numbers kind of make sense and come together as we see more averages kind of balance out. Again, 2 weeks of information and statistics aren't going to be the biggest determining factor in terms of which teams are really the best or the worst at stopping the run in terms of opposing running backs and being able to just limit their points. But again, I just wanted to show you guys this information. So if you, we're wondering about it, we're on the same page. All right, so now that we've covered that, we can go ahead and we can talk about my top 36 running back rankings going into week 3 of the fantasy football season. Again, my number 1 running back shouldn't be a surprise. He was absolutely incredible last night. It's Alvin Kamara, running back of the New Orleans Saints. Alvin Kamara was unstoppable yesterday. 13 touches on the ground for 79 yards. His 9 receptions on 9 targets because of the absence of Michael Thomas led to 95 receiving yards. He has, thus far, already scored 4 touchdowns in the last 2 weeks. Last season, in the 14 games he played, he only had 6 touchdowns. Alvin Kamara is on pace for having another one of these top 3 running back seasons. With the injuries to Saquon Barkley, unfortunately, and Christian McCaffrey, it's looking like more and more of an opportunity for Alvin Kamara to vie for that number 1 running back spot. It's a very good possibility. He is on pace for that. He plays against the Green Bay Packers this week, which is another team that gives up points to the running back position. And again, as long as Michael Thomas is out, and even if he's not out, Alvin Kamara is fantasy relevant as long as he's catching the ball out of this backfield. And he looks like he's the goal line back with Latavius Murray getting limited work. I mean, really limited work yesterday. So again, Alvin Kamara, a great play this week, my number 1. Ezekiel Elliott's my number 2 again. Even with the fact that this team had to throw the ball for majority of the game, they were down 20 in the first quarter. Ezekiel Elliott still had 22 touches on the ground. He had 6 receptions through the air on 7 targets for 33 receiving yards, had a rushing touchdown. Obviously, you probably wanted more. The fact that Dak Prescott stole 3 rushing touchdowns himself, really unfortunate for Zeke owners, but again, that's just how the cookie crumbles. He still had a great week in week 2, and going against this coming week's Seattle Seahawks, it's going to be another question of whether or not this team has to catch up in the game. Even if they have to, it's going to at least give Zeke more opportunity to get involved in the passing game and get himself some more fantasy production. Another one of these consistent backs that you're always starting. Dalvin Cook's my number 3 this week, playing against the Tennessee Titans. Again, the Tennessee Titans kind of got worked on the ground the last couple weeks. Melvin Gordon had a pretty good game against them in week 1. In conjunction with Phillip Lindsay prior to him getting injured. And then this past week, James Robinson absolutely torched them, went for over 100 on 16 carries. So Dalvin Cook, even though this offense has been struggling heavily due to the fact that Kirk Cousins has been struggling, he had negative 1.48 fantasy points last week, an absolutely disgusting number that I don't ever want to see. But that's just, that's just bad luck. I don't even know how that could happen. But either way, I think Dalvin Cook needs to get more involved in this offense. They need to be able to key in on the run and allow Kirk Cousins to sit back and play action situations and let him do whatever the heck he wants. Because honestly, if they're going to perform that badly, it's never going to be good for a running back like Dalvin Cook. So going forward into this week's matchup, Tennessee's been giving up a lot of points on the ground, and hopefully he's going to run away with it this week in a pretty exciting matchup. Now, on the other side, the Tennessee Titans, speaking of them, we talk about Derrick Henry as my number 4 running back. Again, Derrick Henry has not scored a touchdown this season. And though that seems a little underwhelming, he's still getting a lot of touches on the ground, and eventually it's going to tick over. I think this could be the week in which he shows up, runs over the Minnesota Vikings defense, ends up finding himself in the end zone again. The fact that Ryan Tannehill threw for 4 passing touchdowns last week definitely does hurt the potential of Derrick Henry, especially considering he's not getting involved in the passing game as much. But either way, I think Derrick Henry will eventually fall into the end zone one of these times. He'll add a 6-point boost on top of the 10-point, 12-point games he's already having, and then make himself even more fantasy relevant. We'll move on to number 5, Miles Sanders. Like I was mentioning a little bit earlier, they play against the Cincinnati Bengals, and that is one of the easiest matchups that you could possibly have going into week 3. The Cincinnati Bengals gave up 2 touchdowns to both Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt. They could not stop him on the ground. There was a drive in which Kareem Hunt, at the end of the game, was gashing them for 10 yards per carry. It was absolutely unbelievable. But it shouldn't really be a surprise. Cincinnati Bengals are not a great defense. Just as long as Carson Wentz is going to be struggling in the passing game, they're going to have to feed Miles Sanders the ball. He had himself 20 rushing attempts after missing week 1 and week 2. So, and the fact that he had 7 targets, 3 receptions, 36 receiving yards, those are great numbers. And I think going into this week against the Cincinnati matchup, it's pretty easy. They should be able to run all of them. I know their offensive line has been dealing with injuries, but Miles Sanders should be great to go this upcoming week. My number 6 is Jonathan Taylor. It's Jonathan Taylor season, ladies and gentlemen. Jonathan Taylor has finally arrived. Obviously, it had to do with the fact that Marlon Mack injured, out for the season with that Achilles injury, but Jonathan Taylor, this past Sunday, against the Minnesota Vikings, had 26 carries for 101 rushing yards, 1 rushing touchdown, even got himself a little bit involved in the passing game, 2 receptions on 2 targets. It was more than Nyheim Hines got for 9 receiving yards, and had himself an 18-point fantasy game. Now, this upcoming week, plays against the New York Jets. That is going to be a 100% run the ball for the entire game, put it down their throat, let Jonathan Taylor in this offensive line impose their will, and let's just run out the clock. That's pretty much the game plan. And I think Jonathan Taylor would love to do that. He's going to run the ball 25 times, touch the ball 28 times in week 2. I think he's on a pretty good pace to being another one of these top 12 running backs this upcoming season. And I think against the Jets, it just helps him a lot, to be honest. So moving on, we talk about Aaron Jones. Aaron Jones had one of those 40-point games that he always manages to find. Now, the thing is, ladies and gentlemen, do not be surprised if, in fact, Aaron Jones, one of these weeks, in the coming weeks, puts up a 6-point game, because this is what exactly he did last year. He'll have middle-of-the-line performances, 16 points. He'll have a 40-point game, then he'll have a 6-point game. He always fluctuates. I'm not saying it's coming this week. I'm just saying it happens. This upcoming week, he plays against the Saints. The Saints, again, could not really stop the Raiders' running attack, even though the Raiders were missing 2 offensive linemen last night. So again, Aaron Jones, the fact that he's getting as much work as he has over the last couple weeks, 18 touches on the ground, 8 targets in the passing game that led to 4 receptions and 68 receiving yards and a receiving touchdown, 3 total touchdowns this past week. Aaron Jones was a monster. Obviously, he was the number 1 running back with 43.6 fantasy points. But again, we have to remember, he's not even playing 50% of the offensive snaps. Jamal Williams is getting involved. And I think Aaron Jones only played like 48% of the offensive snaps, and he got that kind of opportunity. You know how important he is to this offense, especially when Devontae Adams is injured. It's pretty much all over again from last year. So they're going to definitely be feeding Aaron Jones the ball more and more if, in fact, Devontae is going to be a little banged up with that hamstring or quad injury that he sustained this past week. The next running back I wanted to talk about was Josh Jacobs. Again, I talked about it a little bit earlier. He was missing Trent Brown and Richie Incognito, their left guard, got injured. So again, they were missing 2 of their starting offensive linemen, and they were still able to be productive. Josh Jacobs still surpassed over 100 yards from scrimmage. So again, he still had a pretty good week. A couple touchdowns were yoinked away from him. He even had an opportunity to jump over the pile, in which he fumbled it, unfortunately. Almost got the ball taken away from him by Demario Davis last night. So again, there were opportunities. He was knocking on the door. He just couldn't get it done. So unfortunately, he didn't have that great of a week. But playing against the New England Patriots this upcoming week, I think Chris Carson had himself a pretty good game last week with like 17 touches for 72 yards on the ground. I don't think that the New England Patriots are, impervious to being ran on. Last season, they were really struggling against that without their stud linebackers this upcoming season, with all the guys that have left or opted out. I think there's going to be a good chance that Josh Jacobs in this Las Vegas Raiders offense just runs all over them. So Bill Belichick likes to key in on stopping tight ends. He's probably going to do that with Darren Waller, but Josh Jacobs is going to be able to run free and hopefully get some more work in the passing game, please. The next running back I wanted to talk about was James Conner. And this past week, I was a little uncertain about what he would actually be able to do. Week 1, got injured, was held out. Benny Snell went for 100 rushing yards. And then we thought to ourselves, well, James Conner is going to be out for a little bit. Let's pick up Benny Snell if you're an owner and go ahead and just play him this week and you'll be perfectly fine. But then the whispers started to begin where James Conner was going to potentially play, and then he was active and he was going to play and he had fully practiced and he was ready to go. And I was thinking to myself, is this too good to be true? I want to be safe. I don't want to play a guy that can get injured once again and get pulled out in the next, in the first 15 minutes of the game. And James Conner proved me horribly wrong. He balled out this past week, had himself 106 rushing yards on 16 rushing attempts, 1 rushing touchdown, 2 catches for 15 yards. A fantastic performance. Reestablishes himself as the workhorse back that Mike Tomlin said he was. And going forward, should be a stud. Plays against Houston this week, a defense that, in my opinion, really can't stop the run. As much as they tried last week, Lamar Jackson still got himself 50 on the ground. Mark Ingram went for 50 on the ground and a touchdown. Gus Edwards went for 70 on the ground against them. So again, and then Clyde Edwards in week 1, went for over 100. So again, I think James Conner, this rushing attack, should be finding some success this week. He's my number 9. Number 10 is Nick Chubb. Now, Nick Chubb had himself a fantastic week 2, revitalized his season. A lot of people were questioning what he was going to be able to do in week 1. Week 2, he pretty much silenced all the critics. Now, going into week 3, the Cleveland Browns take on a team that, though they are not the easiest matchup, as of right now, the Washington football team are not giving up a lot of points on the ground to opposing running backs. But I think with Cleveland going up against them, they're going to have to run the ball regardless. And I think they're going to find success because their scheme, everything's beginning to click. They're getting a little bit more of their momentum on their hands, and I think they're going to be able to run the ball successfully against this Washington football team. This past week, again, Nick Chubb had 22 rushing attempts for $124 and 2 rushing touchdowns. Even had himself some work in the passing game. A little sprinkle here and there is going to at least help us out, kind of get us over the edge and make Nick Chubb even more of a viable prospect. But again, as of right now, Nick Chubb as my number 10 against the Washington football team. I love the play. And again, another one of these stud running backs. Speaking of stud running backs, Chris Carson has been scoring touchdowns, but surprisingly, it's been through the air. I mean, we really haven't seen Chris Carson get this many receiving touchdowns. He typically isn't a guy that you can rely there, but over the last couple of weeks, 3 receiving touchdowns. This past week, had 3 targets, 3 receptions for 36 yards again, and that touchdown. But again, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, 17 rushing yards on the 17 rushing attempts, 72 rushing yards against the New England Patriots. So again, had himself a pretty good week overall. Second week in a row in which he's being a stud. At least he got more work on the ground. Really establishes himself as the RB1 of this team. Don't really have to worry about Carlos Hyde, everybody. He's not going to do anything to Chris Carson's value. So again, Chris Carson, another one of these studs, plays against Dallas. I think if and when the Seattle Seahawks take their lead, because they will, Chris Carson is going to be used as a hammer to be able to kill out the clock. And I mean, we go back to 2 years ago when he played against the Dallas Cowboys, the week that he won the job. He had 30 rushing attempts against them, ran all over that defense. So again, maybe Chris Carson's ready to have another party on that defense, and I'm hoping that's the case this upcoming week. We have ourselves Austin Ekeler at number 12. I talked about the potential of this Los Angeles Chargers team absolutely running all over the Carolina Panthers defense because they're giving up nearly 41.5 points per week to opposing running backs in a half PPR setting. Austin Ekeler, even with 16 rushing attempts for 93 yards, a great yard per carry average, I love it, 4 receptions on 4 targets for 55 receiving yards. If I'm not mistaken, I think a lot of that yardage is attributed to the fact that at the end of the first half, Keenan Allen caught like a 30-yard pass and then lateraled it to Austin Ekeler and he recovered it. I think the yards are going somewhere in here. I'm pretty sure it's going there. But again, he had himself a 16.8 fantasy point week in a half PPR without scoring a touchdown. The Carolina Panthers are giving up 3 rushing touchdowns per week on average. Austin Ekeler is going to get one of these. He's going to be a fantasy relevant back to say the least. And he's back on track even with a guy like Joshua Kelley having 25 touches and out of this backfield. It's pretty crazy. Anyway, we move on to our number 13 here, and it's Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Going against the Baltimore Ravens, it's definitely going to be a tough matchup, and that's why I have him outside of the top 12. But there were a couple signs that I really like to see this past week that is going to lead to his success throughout the rest of the season. In week 1, we saw him be a back that was unstoppable on the ground, over 100 rushing yards, over 20 carries. Beautiful. And got himself a lot of goal line attempts. Fantastic. But in week 2, he struggled heavily in terms of getting some momentum on the ground. And again, this team, this Kansas City Chiefs offense was being stopped relatively easily, and they were giving Patrick Mahomes a lot of trouble on third downs early in the game. But later in the game, when everything was on the line, Clyde Edwards was getting hyper targeted in the passing game. Had 8 targets, 6 receptions for 32 receiving yards. That kind of work is what we're going to continue to see as the season progresses and Clyde Edwards gets more experience in the NFL. Again, he is a receiving back at his core. Everything after that is just gravy. And the fact that he can get himself 8 targets, 6 receptions. I mean, Will Fuller didn't get a single target this past week. Clyde Edwards as a running back, getting himself more work. Darrell Williams pretty much disappeared this past week. I know there was a little bit of sprinkles from Darwin Thompson, but again, those are not really going to affect him. I think even though the Baltimore matchup is tough, if he gets more involved in the passing game, he can catch himself a passing touchdown down in the red zone and definitely make himself a fantasy relevant back. So I'm not too worried about his matchup this upcoming week. Kenyan Drake's my number 14. Now, Kenyan Drake, pretty much thus far this season, he's like a 10 to 12 point guy. The question is, can he score a touchdown? Because Kyler Murray's taken touchdowns. Chase Edmonds has taken touchdowns. So the question is, where is Kenyan Drake going to get over the edge and pretty much like jump into that 16 to 18 point running back conversation? And I think this is the week. I mean, playing against the Detroit Lions, again, a defense that just got ran all over by Aaron Jones. I really do think that Kenyan Drake has the definite capabilities of doing so and being a fantasy relevant back there. I mean, 20 touches on the ground against the Washington football team for 86 rushing yards. Only had 2 receptions out of the passing game. But again, as the weeks progress, hopefully we'll get more utilization there. But again, he is the number 1 running back of this team. He's getting a lot of usage on the ground. And I think this week against Detroit has himself a pretty good opportunity to score and be a fantasy relevant back and maybe get into this top 12 conversation finally. I'm hoping that's the case. Number 15 is Melvin Gordon. You know, I was worried about Melvin Gordon last week. I was worried about James Conner. They're literally stacked on top of each other. I was worried about James Conner because of his injury. I was worried about Melvin Gordon because of the potential of playing against the Pittsburgh Steelers. And what the Pittsburgh Steelers did against Saquon in week 1 kind of gave me nightmares. And I thought to myself, do I really want to subject Melvin Gordon to that? And boy, even with the injuries that took place to this team, their quarterback went down. Drew Lock gone. You bring in Jeff Driscoll. You're thinking, oh man, the Pittsburgh Steelers are going to run all over this defense or all over this offense. Nope, that wasn't even the case. Jeff Driscoll came out, had over 220 passing yards, had a couple of passing touchdowns, even completed a touchdown to Melvin Gordon on 2 of his receptions. Again, Melvin Gordon, 19 carries on the ground for 70 yards against the defense that barely allowed, 7 yards on the ground in week 1. I think Melvin Gordon and this offensive line have proven to be, no matter the matchup, they played against Tennessee in week 1. They blew through those guys. They came into week 2 and were pretty productive on the ground and fantasy relevant against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now you get another tough matchup. You get to play against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, but like I mentioned earlier, they're giving about 9 receptions up to opposing running backs per week. So if in fact they're going to key in on that with Phillip Lindsay still injured, let's get Melvin Gordon involved in the passing game, and let's get him into this conversation of perhaps with Jeff Driscoll catching a couple passes down in the red zone because they need some experience on this team with Cortland Sutton going out. And I think right now, Melvin Gordon is the go-to after a Noah Fant down in the red zone. All right, number 16 is Kareem Hunt. Now, a lot of people may not have been expecting that to come out, but to be honest, the fact that Kareem Hunt last week averaged 8.6 yards per carry, 10 total rushing attempts for 86 yards, had a rushing touchdown, had 2 receptions for 15 yards and a touchdown, and was how many fantasy points did he have? 23.1 last week against Cincinnati. Playing against the Washington football team, I don't think it's really a surprise if in fact you go ahead and see Kareem Hunt become a top 16 back once again. The way that this offense is currently functioning, their usage down on the goal line, the fact that Austin Hooper, even though he gets some targets here and there down on the goal line, they're not really looking in his direction. They are looking to either run the ball or pass the ball to Kareem Hunt down there, and he's done that over the last couple of weeks. He's been scoring touchdowns for sure. So I think if in fact this team ends up getting a lead, which they probably could against the Washington football team, they're going to be running the ball heavily, and that is the 1-2 combo of Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt. They're going to find success in this running attack, and I think Kareem Hunt is, at this point, a must-start going forward. Whether he's at your number 2 running back spot or your flex spot, he's a good play. David Montgomery is my number 17, and as of right now, I look at David Montgomery and I see, wow, okay, you had your great work on the ground. Even though you got injured in this game, you did come back in the second half. It was no problem, but the fact that he was getting 3 targets, 3 receptions, 45 receiving yards, and a touchdown is the difference maker. That's what takes David Montgomery from being the number 4 running back and the number 24 overall running back in fantasy to being the number 16 overall running back in fantasy. it really makes the huge jump for him because the opportunity in the passing game is going to lead to potential touchdowns. And as long as Tariq Cohen is pretty much being ignored in the passing game and not being given the opportunity, David Montgomery is going to be, knocking on the door, playing the most snaps out of this backfield. And this upcoming week against the Atlanta Falcons is going to be asked to do a lot as that team likes to, score pretty quickly and actively. I think David Montgomery is going to be a big part of this offense, try to slow them down and try to put some, minutes off the clock with David Montgomery's rushing ability. And then again, if he gets some work in the passing game, fantastic. If he gets some work on the goal line, not going to be surprised. He's my number 17 back. Number 18 is James Robinson. I talked about him yesterday with my waiver wire video. If you have not checked that out, go check it out. James Robinson is a guy that needed to be picked up last week because of his contributions against the Tennessee Titans. This upcoming week, got just as much opportunity and was even more productive. 16 rushing attempts for over 100 rushing yards. Again, he plays against Miami Dolphins this upcoming Thursday. Now, the Miami Dolphins, they've been pretty good against opposing running backs, but that's mainly because teams are just able to pass against them. Or Cam Newton was the running back in week 1 against them that had all those yards. But regardless, I think as of right now, James Robinson is a play going forward until otherwise noted. He's getting the opportunity, and he's definitely delivering on that behind a offensive line and team that we really didn't expect to be able to perform at this level without Leonard Fournette. Because again, we thought this team's tanking, but that's not the case. That's not the narrative. They kind of flipped the script on us here. And James Robinson has definitely come out of nowhere and is a great fantasy option this upcoming week. All right, we move on to Joshua Kelley. Another one of these fantasy options that have come out of nowhere. Another guy that you should have picked up and is in the waiver wire video for this week. Joshua Kelley, the rookie running back out of UCLA, was given 23 touches on the ground. And though those touches did not lead to too many yards, he is still playing a lot of snaps out of this Chargers backfield and getting a lot of touches. He played 52% of the offensive snaps this past week, while Mr. Austin Ekeler played exactly 57%. They're using both these running backs on the field at the same time. Again, you can line up Austin Ekeler out wide. Justin Jackson still dealing with an injury. So it looks like Joshua Kelley is going to be the 1-2 punch. He's going to be the Melvin Gordon of this team going forward. Absolutely fantastic. You add on the top of that they're going to be playing against the Carolina Panthers, a team that cannot stop the run, and they want to give Joshua Kelley this many attempts. Beautiful. Potential touchdown upside. Getting all these touches could lead to over 100 rushing yards. I mean, Leonard Fournette was able to get over 100 rushing yards on like 10 carries against them. I know he had a big run at the end, but even prior to that, I was looking pretty good on the ground. So I think Joshua Kelley at number 19 shouldn't be a surprise and should be a pretty good play this week. Now, speaking of Leonard Fournette has finally broken out. And I think just this past week, the fact that Ronald Jones only had 7 rushing attempts on the ground was the biggest difference maker. Sure, Ronald Jones comes down the field in the first quarter, scores on the first drive with a rushing touchdown. Beautiful. And you would think, okay, maybe they're going to continue to use Ronald Jones because, it's still the first half, it's still early, but that wasn't the case. They rotate in Leonard Fournette, and he takes over this game. I mean, the amount of work he got on the ground wasn't like, oh my goodness, they gave him 30 touches. No. He had 12 touches, but had 103 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, and the most beautiful part, even with LaShawn McCoy getting active in the passing game this past week, Leonard Fournette still had 5 targets for 4 receptions. I don't even care about the receiving yards. You can have 13 receiving yards. It doesn't matter. In fantasy, that does not make a difference to us because the receptions are what we're looking for. The targets, the opportunity is what we're looking for. Because again, if they're going to rely upon a guy out of the backfield to catch the ball, I think Leonard Fournette, and as we all know, is way more talented than Ronald Jones. It is only a matter of time until he takes over that starting running back spot. I think he may have done that. I think he may have eclipsed Ronald Jones this past week. Plays against Denver. Let's not forget, the last time Leonard Fournette played against Denver, what did he do? 200 rushing yards. Dropped it on their skull and dominated that defense. Let's hope that happens this week. He's my number 20 running back going into this week. Moving on to our number 21, we have ourselves Jerrick McKinnon. Again, with Raheem Mostert dealing with that MCL sprain, he's going to be out. Tevin Coleman with an injury, out. George Kittle's a little bit banged up still. I'm sure Jimmy Garoppolo's still injured with that high ankle sprain. This offense, this defense, this 49ers team is struggling heavily to stay healthy. And speaking of a guy that has struggled to stay healthy over the last couple of years, Jerrick McKinnon is fought back and is probably going to be the starting running back this week, and I'm excited to see it. He plays against the New York Giants, and I think this is a huge week for Jerrick McKinnon to come out and stamp that I am fully healthy and I'm ready to take over this starting running back's job going forward, and I'm ready to get more opportunity out of this backfield in a team that wants to run the ball and has a great offensive line and scheme. So hopefully, Jerrick McKinnon, you're up to the task. I expect him to step in for this week and have some pretty good production. And then for the rest of the season going forward, potentially be a flex option in this offense if, in fact, they're trying to limit and keep Raheem Mostert healthy while Tevin Coleman's out still dealing with that injury. I think Jerrick McKinnon going forward, a fantastic option in my number 21. Joe Mixon has been an absolute disappointment over the last 2 weeks. And though that's being the case, I don't really want to ignore him completely and say he's not going to be fantasy relevant and it's impossible. I think there's definitely a possibility, but it requires him scoring touchdowns. 10 fantasy points is fine. It's nice. But I need you to catch some touchdowns, maybe get some more work in the passing game. The fact that Giovanni Bernard was playing just as many snaps as him this past week is depressing. The fact that Joe Mixon only played 50% of the offensive snaps, sure, he had 20 total touches, but those touches weren't really for much. I mean, if you're getting, ran down in the backfield for a negative 5-yard gain, is that touch really worth anything? Is there really much opportunity there? I don't think so, especially when their offensive line playing as bad as they are. They play against Philadelphia. Again, I know the Rams played well against them, and I know Cincinnati could potentially play well against them, but it's going to be tough in my opinion. I think Joe Mixon is going to struggle, and that's why he's this low, but there is still a realm of possibility that he's going to break out, do something crazy. So I leave him at 22 as of right now, and we'll kind of monitor it on the week as we progress. But I think he's going to be a middling player that you could potentially start at your flex position if you don't have any better options, because again, there are a lot of injuries taking place right now. The next option here is Todd Gurley is my number 23 overall back this week. I mean, again, Todd Gurley really fell out of the game script in this game and late in the game, but for majority of the game was running the ball because they needed to kill clock, but he wasn't that great on the ground. I thought Todd Gurley would have been way better with the opportunity given. Had a total of 21 rushing attempts, but only got 61 rushing yards. I thought Todd Gurley would have been way better against the Dallas Cowboys. Unfortunately, that was not the case. This upcoming week has to take on the Chicago Bears. I'm not too excited about that matchup. I think Todd Gurley could struggle there, especially with his lack of opportunity in the passing game. Todd Gurley's relevance is going to be 100% determined by rushing touchdowns. If he cannot score on the goal line, then he is not going to be a fantasy relevant back. That's why he sits on this fringe. But I think this upcoming week in Chicago, I could see him falling into the end zone on top of 70 yards on the ground, having himself, a 13 to 14 point week. I could see that definitely. That's why we sit Todd Gurley here at number 23. All right, number 24, and the last of our RB2s as of this week is Mark Ingram. It took Mark Ingram a little while to be able to at least break out that run in the fourth quarter and put the stamp on the game and pretty much say, you know what, I'm still the starting running back of this team. But that being said, he had less touches than Gus Edwards. And to be honest, everybody had less rushing attempts than Lamar Jackson. This team in the running game is kind of an amalgam of their rotation, and I don't even know if it's a consistent rotation. I don't even know what to expect in terms of 1 week it's J.K. Dobbins, 1 week it's Gus Edwards, 1 week it'll be Lamar Jackson, then the other week it's going to be Mark Ingram. But I think this upcoming week, they're not going to play games. They're not going to rotate, because when you play against the Kansas City Chiefs on Monday Night Football in Baltimore, it's going to be a very fun matchup, but you're going to be put to the test. You're going to have your best players on the field, and you're going to have to give your best players the ball. I think Mark Ingram is that for them, and I think the way that the Chiefs struggled against the run this past week, and they have over the last couple of years, I think Mark Ingram's going to be asked to do a lot, and hopefully he steps up to the plate. Again, 9 rushing attempts for 55 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown this past week. Hopefully gets more opportunity in the passing game. But again, he is the starting running back of this team as of right now and should be good going forward. David Johnson is my number 25. And though David Johnson, isn't really being tested in terms of any other running backs coming in and taking rushing attempts away from him in this organization with Duke Johnson injured, David Johnson has another tough matchup. Has to take on Pittsburgh. And I know I was worried about Melvin Gordon, but this is a completely different scenario, right? Like Melvin Gordon at least is given rushing attempts. David Johnson's had 11 rushing attempts each of the last 2 weeks. That's okay. But, Kareem Hunt's gotten more work out of, the running game out of the last 2 weeks. So, pretty even numbers there. But on top of that, David Johnson's not even getting that much work in the passing game, which we thought would have been a possibility. But like I said prior to the season, the Houston Texans over the last 2 years have targeted the running back position in the passing game the 5th fewest amount of times amongst all NFL teams. So again, David Johnson, this Houston Texans offense, even with them struggling, he'd get a couple targets here and there, maybe 4 a game. If he catches all of them, then he's in a better position. But otherwise, he's definitely going to be struggling against this Pittsburgh Steelers defense. We'll sit him at number 25 this week. The next running back I wanted to talk about was Darrell Henderson at number 26. Again, we know that Sean McVay has come out and said multiple times, this is a committee situation. We're going to rotate. With Cam Akers still injured with that rib injury, and then we have ourselves Malcolm Brown with the finger injury, I think Darrell Henderson could be given the early work, and if they work with a hot hand situation and he starts getting it going with behind this offensive line that is much improved in comparison to last year, Darrell Henderson could work himself out some pretty good opportunity this upcoming week. And I think there is a very good chance that sure, you may start Darrell Henderson and Malcolm Brown comes in and steals all the work. But again, this is, it's a committed situation. You have to hope that Darrell Henderson can win the job and come out early and produce well enough to where he's still getting work in the passing game and then eventually gets those goal line carries early enough to give him some fantasy relevance. But I'm excited about his potential with everybody else hurt in this backfield, and we'll see how it goes as we monitor those guys' injuries going into week 3. The next running back I wanted to talk about was Antonio Gibson. The rookie running back has been asked to do a lot with the Washington Football Organization. Just this past week, led the team in rushing attempts, had himself a rushing touchdown. Beautiful, but he hasn't been asked to get much work in the passing game, which is honestly his strength. If you go back to college, he had more receptions in his final year than he did rushing attempts. So again, this is a receiving back, but they're giving him work on the ground. We've kind of eliminated the idea of Peyton Barber stealing touchdowns, and it's just him and J.D. McKissic. And as of right now, Antonio Gibson given the most touches on the team out of the backfield, a very good sight to see. Now this upcoming week, they play against Cleveland. We know that Joe Mixon struggled there, but I think Antonio Gibson could still be a good flex play this upcoming week with the upside of the receiving game and the goal line work going forward. Could be a great play. He's my number 27. Number 28 is Devin Singletary. Again, as of right now, even though Zach Moss was all the hype and scored early in that for week 1 in the receiving game, it really hasn't kind of added up over the last couple of weeks. Devin Singletary is still dominating the snap percentages and the touches. And I think as of right now, playing against the Rams this upcoming week, the Rams defense is pretty good at stopping the run relatively. But if Devin Singletary could get a little bit of momentum behind him, this past week was averaging 5.6 yards per carry on the ground, got himself some work in the passing game. Obviously, the touchdowns are going to elude these players, but if in fact they do get some work in the goal line red zone area, they could obviously jump into a higher, top 24 conversation with Devin Singletary. But as of right now, without that kind of opportunity, he sits at number 28 as a flex play this upcoming week. Mike Davis is my number 29, a guy that you might be picking up this upcoming week to start in your lineup. The most surprising thing that I saw was Mike Davis had 8 targets, 8 receptions for 74 receiving yards last week. And that in itself is a huge surprise because Mike Davis is a bruiser back. I mean, if we go back and see what he was doing in Seattle, in Chicago, he wasn't really asked to do much in the passing game. Sure, he may have a couple receptions here and there per game, but it wasn't 8 receptions kind of work. So this upcoming week, they play against the Chargers. They've been pretty good against stopping the run, but if Mike Davis can get some value in the passing game, in which Christian McCaffrey wasn't even able to get, then maybe we have ourselves a conversation here where Mike Davis could be, at least fantasy relevant as a flex play with the upside of being the goal line back as well. Kind of looks like Mike Tolbert, but to be honest, plays a lot different. Either way, Mike Davis has some opportunity this week and should be able to have some production. Another player that hopefully will get some receptions this week is Nyheim Hines. Now, even though he only had 0.9 points this past week, I'm not giving up on him. I think Nyheim Hines was definitely, kind of got the short end of the stick this past week. They didn't really need to use him, and they might not need to use him against the New York Jets. They might come out and dominate that defense and have Nyheim Hines as an afterthought because the only time they'll need him is when they're down in the game and when they're needing to come back in the passing game. And Phillip Rivers requires a check down. Nyheim Hines might not be used there against the New York Jets, but I have some hope that hopefully he'll come back, have himself a pretty good week, catch the ball 5-6 times, get some work on the ground, and again, play the second fiddle to this Jonathan Taylor and potentially have himself some fantasy value. He's my number 31. Now, James White didn't play in week 2, unfortunately, because of the passing of his father. My condolences. It's absolutely horrible. And it's a very, sad situation with him. He missed the game. But family comes first, of course. Hopefully, James White is going to be able to play sooner rather than later. Again, James White is a huge part of this offense. And even though Rex Burkhead had himself, a lot of touches out of this backfield and got some work here and there, James White is the better version of a Rex Burkhead and hopefully can come into this offense and help them win some games in the coming weeks. Again, as of right now, this upcoming week, they play against the Las Vegas Raiders. The Raiders are, again, another one of these teams that give up a lot of points to opposing running backs. We just saw Alvin Kamara catch the ball 9 times against them. And I think if James White is healthy, ready to go, can be a fantastic fantasy play this week. But it's just a matter of whether he's ready. And if he's not ready, then so be it. We'll try to run Rex Burkhead out here this upcoming week in the dink and dunk gameplay. But as of right now, I'm hoping James White can come back and play because they need a running back too. Sony Michel hasn't been able to produce. I think James White's the answer. The next running back is Myles Gaskin. Again, Myles Gaskin I've been talking about, and I'm really high on him. And again, he had 7 rushing attempts this past week for 46 rushing yards, 7 targets, 6 receptions, 36 receiving yards, had 11 fantasy points. That's back-to-back weeks of 10-plus fantasy points in a half PPR scenario. He's had the most snap counts out of this backfield amongst all running backs. He's played 63% of the offensive snaps in week 1 and 65% of the offensive snaps in week 2. Again, 2 weeks in a row, that is a great sign to see. I think as of right now, going forward, Myles Gaskin is going to continue to get work, and in this game against the Jacksonville Jaguars, he's going to be asked to do a lot in terms of the third down work, and hopefully, lead to his success. He could be a great flex play this upcoming week in a PPR format. Another running back I wanted to mention again is Dion Lewis. With the injuries that are taking place in the San Francisco defense, again, they sent Richard Sherman to the IR. Dee Ford is probably out. They lose Solomon Thomas, Bosa, and they are starting to fall apart defensively and offensively in terms of injuries. If this is a continuing thing and this team is going to be, missing 5 of their defensive starters, then they're not going to be the same San Francisco 49ers defense. And to be honest, if Dion Lewis, healthy this upcoming week, is going to get the work in the passing game, because again, he'll get a couple touches on the ground, but I don't think it's going to lead to much. I think his work in the passing game is going to be able to separate himself from the pack and potentially give himself some extra fantasy value. So as of right now, I'm not too, alarmed at the potential opportunity he's going to have. This past week, again, had 5 targets, 4 receptions for 36 yards, had himself a rushing touchdown. I think there's a great opportunity there for him to be a flex play. He's my number 33. Number 34 is Malcolm Brown. Like I mentioned, he's dealing with a finger injury, but if he's healthy and ready to go, he's going to get himself 10 to 15 touches this upcoming week, because again, this is a committee situation, and if in fact he is the hot hand, they're going to allow him to run away with it. So as of right now, Malcolm Brown's not a bad option. Just keep in mind that this offense against the Buffalo Bills is probably going to try to run the ball on them, because again, I think Buffalo has some weak points at their linebackers and being able to stop the run. They're great coverage linebackers, but in terms of stopping the run, they haven't been great over the last couple years. We move on to DeAndre Swift as my number 35. As of right now, I look at the matchup against the Arizona Cardinals. I think the Cardinals are going to score a lot against Detroit. And where does that leave the Lions? That leaves them pretty much having to come back in this game. Passing the ball to DeAndre Swift, who's been catching the ball the last couple of weeks, multiple times. Just this past week, 5 targets, 5 receptions for 60 receiving yards. Great numbers there. Hopefully he can get some more work on the running game. I mean, again, Kerryon Johnson and Adrian Peterson are probably going to dominate there. But again, this is the most talented running back in that backfield as of right now, and hopefully he gets more opportunity. The last running back I wanted to mention is Ronald Jones. Even though Ronald Jones, in my opinion, is eventually going to fade away in this offense, he'll probably still get some work this week against Denver and kind of keep himself somewhat relevant. But I do think that Leonard Fournette's going to separate himself. I mean, we really could put anybody at this number 36 spot. We could put Frank Gore here for all we know. Maybe a revenge game against the Indianapolis Colts could be nice for him. We could put a running back like Chase Edmonds. I think Chase Edmonds against Detroit could be a great option. But again, there are maybe even Jeff Wilson Jr. to be honest. There are a bunch of options this upcoming week, but again, these rankings are subject to change. Hopefully you guys like today's video. Again, for those of you who are looking to stay up to date on rankings and see how these rankings are going to rotate throughout the week, you can either show up on Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. PST, try to get your question answered, and with the updated rankings, or you can go to patreon.com/AndrewKiorkof, support my efforts as you get free fantasy football content here on YouTube. But again, if you want the premium content, flex rankings, Discord community server, unlimited questions answered, you can go to patreon.com, get all that information. Outside of that, tomorrow, Wide Receiver Wednesday. Hopefully you guys are excited. Don't forget, smash that like button. Really does make a difference. Subscribe to the channel. And until next time, everybody, thank you very much, and I'll see you guys. Peace.